I am here today with Tony of One Dime, coming to us all the way from the Great White North. And I've been a fan of his for a long time. I did a conversation with him on his channel, which everyone should definitely go and watch after they're done with this, of course. But for people who don't know you, Tony, would you mind introducing yourself? Tell the audience a little bit about your background, especially as regards philosophy, and what you're doing with your channel, and kind of what your goal is with your channel.
Yeah, it's great to be talking with you again. I really enjoyed that conversation we had back when you went on One Dime Radio to discuss Machiavelli, Nietzsche, and Ibn Khaldun, I believe. One Dime Radio is my second channel. It's my podcast, which surprisingly is what generates me the income that makes this sustainable due to Patreon. But it's actually my smaller channel. It's my main channel. It's called One Dime, just in general, and it's basically a video essay channel. I do mini documentaries as well here and there. I'm probably most known for the Cultural Revolution one, and I've also done videos on modern monetary theory, Byung-Chul Han's Burnout Society, and various other topics. My big arc is actually explaining various political ideologies in the history of Marxism. That's kind of my next arc. And I guess, yeah, what I would say is I do pretty much anything regarding the social sciences because that's my background, particularly political science. I started this channel quite a while ago, probably about 4 years ago, but I took a bit of a pause when I was finishing grad school, particularly my dissertation. And right as I was finishing my dissertation, it was a coincidence that some of my old videos started popping off, such as my Burnout Society video, and my deficit myth video had was reacted to by Hassan Piker, the Twitch streamer, very popular figure these days. He was reacting to my video, and that kind of gave it a boost to the algorithm, which started promoting it more. And then, it kind of goes from there. So I was like, okay, still then it wasn't like my channel is not super famous or anything like that. But from there, I was like, okay, why not actually try YouTube, you know, f- like more seriously? So that's what I've been doing. It's also difficult because I also been trying to finish a book in the meantime, which is related to democracy and the history of the way it's been understood and try to build on the work of Sheldon Wolin. But yeah, maybe to put it succinctly, pretty much what I try to do is take what I learned in the academic world, in the social sciences, and try to use it to explain things in a fun, engaging way on YouTube because academia sucks.
Yeah, I agree, and I also know the pain of trying to get work done on a book while you're also trying to run a YouTube channel. I've been, as my followers know, working on the same book now for basically saying it's almost done for probably almost a year. That it can be tough. You mentioned doing some recent work on MMT, or before we get into that, you also talked to Benjamin Studebaker about sort of like the end of neoliberalism, end of the neoliberal moment. I was really very fascinated with that conversation, and it kind of like aligned with just, I don't know, various sorts of ideas I've been encountering recently. Of course, you mentioned Ibn Khaldun earlier. I've always been very interested in his work. I got introduced to him through Peter Turchin. Peter Turchin, he has this structural demographic theory of history, but he also came to the conclusion that something really strange happened in America in the 1970s, almost like a cultural shift towards individualism and towards just like losing faith in the ability of the government to really do anything economically. Big push towards meritocratic achievement, even on the left, as the path for economic success. That also lined up with, I know you and I have both seen Adam Curtis's films. He kind of talks about this cultural moment that happened in
Mm-hmm.
the 60s and 70s. I know you've brought up there are a lot of flaws with Curtis's approach at times, but I think he was keying into something real. Thomas Frank also talked about this in his book, Listen Liberal, on sort of the level of like internal Democratic Party politics. It's kind of indeterminate when it happened, but there was a shift toward this neoliberal cultural ideology that sort of took America by storm, you could say, the whole Western world. Could you maybe like give your thesis on like what neoliberalism is, Do you think that it is a meaningful term? Because I know you guys debated about that a little bit. What do you think about it as like a cultural consciousness, like a movement in cultural consciousness? And is it coming to an end?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, I could tell you found that episode interesting because it's rare that I get asked to go on a podcast to talk about a podcast episode I do, because usually it's the video essays. But yeah, it's cool that you took interest into that because I did as well. And I won't speak for Studebaker because people can maybe check out that episode to hear his views. Um, I I'm influenced by Benjamin Studebaker. That's why I have him on my show a lot. But we don't share the exact same views. I will give my thesis on it. I won't speak for him because he lays his out pretty clearly. But I think when it comes to this thing we call neoliberalism, he questions whether it's a good category. And I agree with him in that the word neoliberalism has sort of become a boogeyman used by left wing intellectuals and academics to sort of describe everything that went wrong and to act like, this is when everything went to shit. And it's sort of used in a cultural way now too, to say neoliberalism in the same vein as like late capitalism or whatever. It's sort of almost a fashionable thing to say when describing why things are bad. It's almost a stereotype at this point where it's like behind every leftist cultural critique, people who are derivative of Frederick Jameson types, postmodernism, cultural logic of late capitalism, or Mark Fisher, they'll kind of be influenced by that and they'll make video essays that say, here are these problems in society. There are systemic problems in society. Ba ba bam. What is the problem? Neoliberalism. And it's often used as a way to not think. But I do agree, and as you've alluded to, that there's various thinkers who have pointed to something that has happened since the 1970s. Regardless of what we want to call it, something changed in the 70s. You mentioned Peter Turchin, you mentioned Adam Curtis. I think Adam Curtis is fantastic at capturing the zeitgeist that we might call neoliberalism. And I think that's what's important here, this word zeitgeist, because I think neoliberalism is more so a set of things we try to use to describe the fundamental shift in the world spirit that happened in 1970s. And I know it's kind of funny to invoke such Hegelian phrases on a Nietzschean podcast, but it's often portrayed, neoliberalism, as a set of ideas that began with certain economists like Friedrich Hayek and then developed by Milton Friedman and then implemented by Maggie Thatcher and Ronald Reagan, right at the time when there was a stagflation crisis in which the post-war Keynesian order, ranging from welfare capitalism on the more moderate end, like America, to the more social democratic socialist variety in Europe, when that couldn't adequately respond to the stagflation crisis in the 70s, this was when the neoliberal ideas became seen as an answer to it. And the ruling class, if you take the more, left-leaning narrative, took this as an opportunity to essentially perpetuate class struggle, but on the other side, to decimate the labor unions and use neoliberal ideas of free markets and deregulation and privatization, world trade, and all that to justify ultimately a further, weakening the power of unions and ultimately allowing business to run free. Yet, I'm sure as given that you've heard that episode, it's far more complicated than that, in that there's a whole set of left-wing origins of neoliberalism as well. I think ultimately what most people get wrong with neoliberalism is that they try to portray it as a set of ideas that influenced a bunch of governments and that these governments did these policies and these policies are why things are shit. But I think more so, when you see a phenomenon that occurs on a global scale, it's really beyond the ideas at that point. So like you see neoliberalism is really like a global process. It occurs in virtually almost every single developed first world country, to a large extent, even the third world countries too. You see it at different paces. Some countries in Europe, you could say moved to a more neoliberal order slower than others. Like France, it took a lot longer due to the fact that whenever they tried to privatize anything in France, the people protest and blow up a bunch of cars and do a mini
Yeah, light
revolution.
things on fire. Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah,
they protest their government quite a lot, quite heavily.
right, yeah, or like Sweden, which had its neoliberal shift quite a bit later. In the 70s, when everyone else was doing neoliberalism, it still had a self-described democratic socialist as president. But when you see a shift occurring in so many countries, it really suggests that you can't reduce what is happening to a bunch of like academics who came out of the ivory tower to mastermind this great big plan of neoliberalism that a bunch of baddies implemented, whether it be Thatcher or Blair or, Reagan, etc. Neoliberalism ultimately was like a zeitgeist, and I view it as a shift in the world economy and capitalism. So, as you had producer economies moving to consumer economies, these ideas that became fashionable in the period, they largely got popular because of that zeitgeist, if that makes sense. I don't think ideas create the zeitgeist. It's that the ideas that succeed tend to be ones that embody the zeitgeist. The ideas of Hayek were actually seen as quite fringe in his time. Like when Keynes was the consensus, Hayek was seen as very fringe figure that people didn't take that seriously. When you had the stagflation crisis, and you had also you had the stagflation crisis, which gave a whole right-wing rationale for neoliberal policies. You also had this whole anti-bureaucratic movement, which was largely driven by the left, the 60s and 70s new left, which was so anti-state, anti-bureaucracy. You could say it was in the likes of Marcuse and the Frankfurt School. It was in the likes of Deleuze, Foucault, these postmodern thinkers. And, they had a real reason for that, given that there was a sort of disillusionment with the idea that socialism amounted to state control, whether it be on the social democratic bent with like the Labor Party or the Soviet kind. People wanted a third way. So you get a third way leftism, which is like very libertarian. And on the right, you get a kind of third way capitalism. But ultimately, what this sort of leads to is like what it was the dominant ideology, arguably maybe up until recently. We can debate as to whether it's still the dominant ideology. But what I would say is, I'm fiscally conservative and socially liberal. You hear this saying in a lot of countries in Canada, America, and I think that is ultimately what like neoliberalism turned into. If you hear one-sided accounts, you'll hear it differently. You'll see left-wing accounts of neoliberalism that are very like partisan and left-wing, like Wendy Brown. They'll try to really underplay the extent to which neoliberalism was socially left-wing. They'll try to say actually it was socially right-wing, but really what they're doing is they're only highlighting the right-wing advocates of neoliberalism, like Reagan. And on the right side, you'll have really an attempt to kind of act like what they're proposing is actually a return to classical liberal principles, which it partially is, but with a huge added statist component to that, and an acceptance with what was happening, which was a move to the left socially, in large ways driven by the economy and also driven by movements. You could say the women's movement, queer movement, all of that, which, I think most of us wouldn't say are bad things in any way. But what you have is, like, objectively speaking, like a kind of social move to the left that is unprecedented. As you also have a decline of industrial working class with a service economy and global trade that makes it easy to outsource labor. A lot of left-wing intellectuals, activist leaders start seeing the proletariat as no longer the main agent of change, and they start focusing more on, different minority groups, different persecuted groups. And it leads to very different sets of politics. But the thing about neoliberalism, right, is neoliberalism as a zeitgeist kind of incorporates all of this. You can't really separate any of these things. While on the face of it, you might see like a lot of new left movements as antithetical to what we might think of neoliberalism. At the end of the day, they are part of a zeitgeist, which is anti-bureaucratic, anti-state, and anti-authority as such, which has its capitalist variant as well, because the capitalist variant wants to break down all barriers on capital, and the left wing variant wants to break down all barriers on human desire and freedom. While they ultimately want different political outcomes, what you do get is a sort of zeitgeist, which is very pro freedom, but also like very pro capitalist, in that the barriers for what can be commodified are basically unlimited now.
Wow, that there are so many directions I want to go with that, and I have so many thoughts that I'm struggling to hold them all in my head right now. But so it's interesting something you said, sort of in the middle there. We've made this transition from producer economies to consumer economies. That the zeitgeist is sort of, in a way, a reflection of that, and I think that's one of the most succinct ways to put it. I think it's a lot of what Adam Curtis was actually getting at. And you said it right there at the end with the endless abilities to commodify everything, to get people to consume, basically, to an unprecedented degree. The freedom, the shift leftward is a huge part of that. It like feeds into the capitalist free market, the explosion of that kind of like of that those kinds of principles into the zeitgeist on like an unprecedented level. You brought up the postmodernists and the critical theorists. People like Deleuze and Foucault, I've talked about on the show, I do think are genuinely influenced by Nietzsche. I do think Nietzsche is a genuine ancestor of postmodern thinking. And it is interesting. I mean, I completely get your point, right? About that like anti-authoritarian left and the way that that feeds into this whole zeitgeist. While also acknowledging I am 100% in agreement as well, these cultural movements aren't coming from ideas from academia. Like, I don't understand the level of power that people attribute to the critical theorists or to postmodernists. And we all know the major public intellectual who made a big deal out of that one.
The postmodern neo-Marxists.
Well, it depends on what you mean by that. But that's the thing, is that that's kind of, they've been a whipping boy for a long time. And it is kind of funny that you can kind of blame them for anything, right? Because the way you just laid it out, I could see how, and there are Marxists who will do this, who will basically say the real thing that subverted Marxism and messed up our movement were these critical theorists who wanted to do it culturally, and these postmodernists who broke down like our theories of truth and reality and like scientific realism. We need
Gabriel Rockhill's. I have an article that I'm not sure when it's going to come out, just because, but I have an article critiquing him.
Well, right. Well, it's just funny though, because that's like that's coming from the left-wing side. Like, we want to do scientific socialism, and here are these people criticizing science and making socialism a cultural movement. They're responsible for capitalism, neoliberalism, that whole moment. But then it's funny that you have on the right-wing side, we don't even have to talk about Kermit. I mean, there's, like Andrew Breitbart was talking about this like 20 years ago, that there are these postmodernists who, in the like cultural Marxists, they're turning a socialist or something like that. That it's like they're completely the opposite. They're to blame for subverting capitalism. And it's just funny that like the postmodernists can sort of be the whipping boy for everybody, when in actuality, and I would completely agree with you, to the extent that they express those ideas, like there's philosophers expressing ideas all the time. The reason why they got popular is because there was a moment where that the culture was ready to seize on those critiques of authority, which I think to some extent were legitimate, like even when Marcuse was making them. And so I think it's almost like shooting the messenger. Postmodernists, and I think Frederick Jameson sees them this way, that's sort of like they're the reflection of the material conditions of late capitalism or something like that, is that you're going to get these postmodern theories. And but he kind of like, treats it almost like disparagingly, at least in my reading.
Mm-hmm.
But that doesn't mean that they're not like reflecting the truth of the state of affairs, the human state at that moment.
Mm-hmm.
Or that there isn't, is it not possible that that's a sublation as well? That we have to, if we're thinking Hegelian terms about this, that it's like the negation of the modernist theory of truth might be necessary to move on to whatever new form of consciousness is going to be.
No, I think you put it well when you said that these thinkers perhaps are more of a reflection of the zeitgeist rather than, people who are perpetuating it or causing it. And yeah, that's precisely what I think shallow analyses get wrong. You see like right wing and left wing variants of this, like Jordan Peterson obviously will try to say, he really gets this idea from a bunch of other people before him. He's far from the first right winger to say these postmodern neo-Marxist intellectuals are the reason why people think this way. People are getting brainwashed in academia. Or you even have like left-wing attacks on this to try to blame it for the fall of class politics. To be honest, like, there's a guy who's getting popular now, Vivek Chibber, and I'm very sympathetic to what he's trying to do. So I don't want to sound like I'm attacking the guy, but I think his analysis kind of is totally misses the forest for the trees. He looks at like the rise of this synthetic leftism that gets very popular in academia, and it's why the left sucks now. Basically, it ultimately benefits capitalism, but I think the postmodern turn is very much a reflection of the real world zeitgeist, and that reflection is not merely a mystification or a misdirection. It is a real legitimate response to what is going on. When you have so many things happen all at once, you have to be a fool to believe that like all of them were completely wrong and that you would have done something different if you were in their shoes. If you see such a trend seems to occur all at once, it is unlikely that if you were in their shoes, you would have somehow like been the wise guy to not jump ship, right?
You know what's funny about this, just really quick, is that
Mm-hmm.
the argument, as you put it there, is like that's how Jordan Peterson used to talk about convincing people that, when they would say, like, well, if I had been in the Soviet Union, I wouldn't have committed those atrocities or something like that. He's
Right.
like, don't be so sure, sunshine. And
Oh
so
yeah,
it's like,
yeah, yeah, yeah.
yeah, it's like, Jordan, if you were a professor in the 60s, you would have been a postmodernist. Hell, he's basically a postmodernist
I
today,
think he
but we
is a
don't need
post.
to.
Well, kind of,
Right.
kind
Not,
of.
he's like, somebody put it, I forget who it was. I saw somebody on X say that he's like an SNL sketch of like a postmodernist, like literally deconstructing every word of a question and you
Right.
can't answer it. But anyway, sorry, I don't want to
He is
sidetrack
kind
us
of
with that, but
Peterson's original philosophical influences seem to actually be the pragmatist school, which if he was consistent about that, that would actually be more interesting. But he's so inconsistent, and he does sound like a postmodernist a lot of the time in how he, uses his rhetorical gaffes. Like I think you've seen recently, whenever he tries to get weasel his way out of a question, he'll
really
say,
basic
"Well,
questions.
it depends what you mean by this. It depends what you mean by that." He'll invoke, these sort of arguments. But okay, with regard to like the 60s and the 70s and the postmodern turn. So, people like Gabriel Rockhill, Vivek Chibber, even though these are different, Vivek Chibber might be a guy who represents sort of the social democratic, radical social democratic Bernie wing of the left. And Gabriel Rockhill maybe represents the Marxist Leninist wing of the left, which I find to be so much worse in every way imaginable. But may not because it's so authoritarian, but because I think their politics is even more confused than everything they criticize. But we can get into that later. They ultimately try to act like these thinkers were propped up because they benefit the establishment, and what you need is a non they call it the compatible left, and I find this phrase really interesting, the compatible left, because the way they juxtapose that is with what they implicitly position as like their politics being a non-compatible left. But if you look at the way like any historical transformation or revolution or any political change occurs, it occurs usually with the zeitgeist, not against it. So like the idea that this is a compatible left and that we're the non-compatible left, we just need an ideology that is not compatible with the prevailing ideology. I mean, you don't actually see historically any change occur like this. Usually when there's any big change, it's because ideas are already headed in that direction. So
Yeah, I
like,
mean, like that's the formula for a cult. Like the rest of the world is evil and deluded, and we have the truth.
right. Yeah. Now, well, it's not a coincidence why most, radical left groups today are like these micro sects that turn into cults pretty much. Because when they say, oh, everyone is wrong and, ultimately it's me and we got it right, everyone else is wrong, you just end up building mini cults. But the truth is that any politics that succeeds is either like an outgrowth of this current ongoing world spirit, or at least rhetorically appeals to that. If you try to go so hard against it, it's just not going to go anywhere. And, this world zeitgeist, this is what I want to clarify here. It's not like just a realm of ideas. It's totally materially constituted. And I alluded to that when saying this shift of the producer to consumer economy, because why is there a neoliberal zeitgeist? Well, you have a total shift in the economy after the post-war era. Already with the post-war era, you start to have, after like essentially the war economy runs out, like America's for a long time selling everything to the world, selling weapons to the world. It's selling much more than it is actually buying, but it transitions to a consumer economy as it, runs out of people to sell things to. And as capitalists want more profit, you have different means of accumulating that. And you also get, as people get wealthier, economies get wealthier, they tend to just move in a consumer economy. So you have that, and it's only natural that you're going to get free trade deals come out of that, because that just facilitates that. Simply, it's better. If you're going to produce consumable items, you're going to naturally want labor to be cheaper, and you're going to try to facilitate, agreements, free trade agreements that loosen the barriers to that. And you can make right-wing and left-wing ideological arguments for it. You can, on the right, say, well, it's ultimately good for the freedom of business. The left likes to act like they don't like business, but it's very easy to sell this sort of vision to leftists if you just say, well, we want world peace, so it's better to have free trade and cooperation with countries. In fact, actually, the European Union, which the precursor to the European Union, I forget, it's called the European
It,
Economic Community,
or even before that, the European coal and steel communities is like the first incarnation that eventually they go through several iterations. But yeah, it starts as a giant industrial trading cartel that
right,
slowly brings in more industries in more countries.
right, and the one before the EU, the precursor, is pushed by the French socialist president, not Mitterrand, François Mitterrand. And it's sold as like this sort of utopian kind of like vision. And I mean, it's, these ideas aren't really new. Like even Immanuel Kant thought that like if you have a world with more free trade, there would be no reason for war.
Yeah, perpetual peace.
Yeah,
He
perpetual peace.
basically lays out the case for a European Union in that essay.
Yeah, yeah.
It's
And I
funny
mean,
because people like to bash Kant's politics. Like people will say Kant's politics are the least interesting thing about him philosophically. His arguments aren't good. His arguments don't, derive from like his more deep, abstruse metaphysical and moral philosophy, or at least not as convincingly. But it's just funny because if you read Perpetual Peace, it's like it most clearly reflects what the political result of the Enlightenment would be, which actually means it's a very insightful work, in my
it
opinion.
is, yeah. No, Kant is phenomenal. I mean, just phenomenal thinker. So this shift from a consumer economy, which, has this is what's so important to emphasize every time. Any analysis that tries to look at it like the left versus the right. After the post-war era, at least, these categories aren't that helpful for explaining shifts, because at the level of mainstream establishment politics, the left and right are left and right wings of capitalism, and they have different ways of selling ultimately like similar ideologies, but with different ideological justifications, legitimation stories, because they have a different set of electorates to appeal to. They have a different electorate. Like the left wing bases are going to be very open to ideas that frame things in terms of like freedom, in terms of liberation. Whereas the right will, talk about ultimately like more lower taxes or less government on your back or whatever. Now, the shift to the consumer economy, from the producer economy to the consumer economy, is pretty much, I think, the single-handedly the biggest reason why you get a dramatic, unprecedented shift in social progressivism, more than we've ever seen before. On the one hand, you can't like take anything away from the feminist movements and the actual real like political movements and fighting for rights and stuff. But that is also in large part allowed due to this shift. So when you have a shift to a consumer economy, that's a service industry economy. In service industry economies, women can do that work. There's almost no justification you can make to say women aren't equipped to do that. Whereas with hard menial labor, you can make that argument more easily, right? Service economy, in fact, you could even argue, I mean, some people have argued that women are better at it if you believe in these kind of essentialized gender differences, that is. But in any case, you do have a fundamentally different world and a fundamentally different economy, an economy where you want to encourage people not to be austere, not to have the Protestant work ethic where you save all your money, right, and try to consume as little as possible. You do want to keep the Protestant work ethic, but not because of any duty, but because it's your passion, because it is life's prime want to work. And ultimately, but you also want to live your best life. You want to enjoy as much as possible. It's why I think thinkers like Zizek, Slavoj Žižek, Byung-Chul Han, Fisher, and Jameson are much better at capturing the zeitgeist than people like Deleuze and Foucault. Although actually, I think they're great too, but I think they're actually more like products of the zeitgeist rather than great critics of it. In that they ultimately they resemble the zeitgeist, like in terms of Deleuze talking about deterritorialization and reterritorialization. I don't want to bring too many jargon filled terms here, but with Zizek and Fisher and these people, what they get right is that they understand that like the new form of capitalism, the new spirit of capitalism is not one in which desire is inhibited. In fact, the new spirit of capitalism, stuff like sexism, stuff like patriarchy, even stuff like racism, are actually hindrances, obstacles to capitalism. In that, ultimately, if you're a consumer economy, as a business, you want to appeal to the most consumers as possible. You also want people to consume as much as they want, unburdened. Now, what does that mean? It means that you don't want people feeling guilty about consuming. You want people to feel guilty about not consuming enough. So that like completely changes the set of ideologies now that are likely to permeate and that are likely to coincide with financial interests. And Adam Curtis captures this well, by the way. Like I think Adam Curtis is just he is good. Like I have my critiques, but like Century of the Self, totally understands. And the trap is my favorite one, where he talks about like, freedom is this new kind of buzzword that political parties all across the aisle are obsessed with using, but ultimately use to sell a vision that commodifies everything.
Yeah, the way that you assess the situation is very similar to me in the way that I see, yeah, mostly the same interests as far as like those who are in power, that is simply pitched in different ways. And I'm very skeptical that we're actually experiencing like anything like democracy in the ideal sense of democracy. Obviously, I think politically speaking, socially speaking, materially speaking, obviously we're in a different situation from like an autocratic regime. I'm not saying there's no difference, but we've successfully obfuscated the fact that there is very little input from the bottom up to like course correcting. But that's all sort of an aside. I mean, I think a lot of what you point out really draws attention, or it like elucidates why there are so many on the right now who have associated many of these left-wing progressive values with capitalism. So you actually say, okay, so there's like the new American Communist Party on the left who are sort of like turning against social progressivism as well. I know they would, many of them would disagree with me saying that, but they just don't have the same kind of.
No, they are. They are totally. I think they would even agree with that. They are fundamentally.
Right. Well, but they would also like push back if if you just say like, well, they're cool with bigotry. They would say, no, we're not. But they don't have the same.
I wouldn't say. I wouldn't go. Well, I don't know enough about them to really say whether maybe there are bigoted people, but I wouldn't say even being reactionary is necessarily the same as being a bigot. Like I would say they're reactionary, but reactionary doesn't mean bigotry. I mean, I think, for example, Xi Jinping is reactionary. That doesn't mean that's bigotry. Like I don't use these terms in with these like
I mean, let's be
heavily
real. He's
morally
he's
coded.
probably bigoted towards some people,
Maybe,
like in
yeah, like
China.
sure,
Yeah.
perhaps, but like this is what I'm just saying is like, I think we should use a lot of these terms, get used to using these terms without the kind of baggage, because sometimes for some people it's like an insult. If you're a reactionary, it's an insult. Whereas I think just no, like I mean, being a reactionary just it does mean you want to roll back the wheel of
Right.
progress. Like
Yeah.
that's
Like
if you want
you
to
could
believe
say
that,
they're
fine, but that's just like that's an objective descriptor for some people's views.
right. You could say they're like social reactionaries, even if they're still committed to Marxism. But then, like, you have this really interesting thing going on the right as well, with like accelerationism, where they sort of like want to accelerate this process of, that capitalism is almost like it was like a really powerful engine driving society. But as you sort of, the analogy I've heard is like it's like control rods. It's like you have a critical mass that's created by the market, and you start pulling out the control rods. This would be like the sort of NRX view of things. That basically you had these old, what would you say, sort of like bulwarks against unrestrained capitalism, but they wouldn't say it's like unions. They would say it was like the church or like the family. And by the way, I think they're right to a large extent, right? That under
I agree.
medieval Christendom, it was not all about profit margins and GDP. They didn't think in those terms. And there was this massive acceleration, as you say, of social progressivism that coincided with this massive liberalization of the market. So really, it's not even like deregulation is a better term. You kind of spoke to this earlier that it's kind of shaking up our politics a little bit, and maybe this points to perhaps the end of the neoliberal moment that now I see. They seem fringe now, right? I think they reflect like a broader discontent with the entire outcome of neoliberalism. I do want to take a moment before going on with this argument to just say people often underestimate the benefits of neoliberalism, or like just how great it has been to live in the imperial core. Like it's so often said, like we focus on these things, the ways in which like global trade and all of these things have caused all of these problems. Often that's the discourse. But we wouldn't have done those things if there wasn't a real advantage. Like when you become the global reserve currency, you actually want your currency flowing throughout the rest of the world in other people's hands and them trading in your money. When you become a consumer economy, like being a consumer economy, that's the goal of that's what so many countries would like to eventually be, is having access to this like vast marketplace of goods for like a really cheap price. Like that's such a great thing. And like as you said, there's been all these social benefits as well that have come on the heels or alongside capitalism just because of the logic of the market. And it's very hard for me to imagine, and this is kind of like the way the discourse has gone around this. I'm sure you saw that video, like the AI generated video that the Chinese shared of like fat Americans working in like sweatshops. And, that's kind of the question. It's like, okay, do you really want to go back to being a producer economy? Like there are serious advantages or reasons why you wanted to get out of that. And that's why I'm very sympathetic to the view that you mentioned earlier when you're talking about compatibilism of like anytime somebody's outlining a political vision for me, if it doesn't involve reconciling to what we have now and like taking the advantages and in some way like, yeah, okay, we want to overcome where we are now, but I'm not impressed by anyone who's like, well, if we went back to the way things were, it would be fine or something like this. Or like some sort of like pie in the sky like idea that just denies human nature, like these magical thinking solutions. Like there's so much of that just going on from all sides of it. But all of that being said, there are a lot of people who are discontented. Maybe they're the people who have lost in terms of like the industrialization. Maybe they're just social reactionaries who don't like the rapid shift in values that has happened. Or maybe all sorts of other reasons, right? That just like, that there are like real reasons for an existential malaise living in this globalized market when you do realize that you're just like an input in this machine of production and consumption that doesn't seem to have any end or purpose other than, again, like growing these numbers, which you could say is kind of like the outcome of like a utilitarian viewpoint that is the end of history in terms of if you view everything in terms of these calculations about pain and pleasure, it does seem like, at least if you're living in, again, the imperial core, you're doing pretty well. We just need to grow the system and expand it to everybody, right? That would be like the logic. Nevertheless, that malaise is there. Maybe it's the Nietzschean coming out in me of like the meaninglessness of the whole thing, or just dissatisfaction with one element of it or another. In terms of your own personal opinion, your preferences, it's like, okay, how do we take the massive benefits that we've accumulated and move on to the next thing? Is there even a, that's one of the things I like about Curtis is that one of the things he kind of points to with this malaise is like nobody even seems to have a vision of that. It's all magical thinking. It's all return to tradition type thinking. Or we just need to go back to the way things were in the 50s or the 90s, or like no one does seem to have like an understanding of what could come next that incorporates all of the benefits that the things that we've come to become used to in this economy and this culture that's been created that we recognize as a good. I don't know. There's just this glibness about all of the benefits.
Mm-hmm.
The very glib dismissal of things like you mentioned before, like gender equality. Like there's just right wing reactionaries just be like, but that was all a mistake. It's like, do you really know what you're advocating for? Would you want to live in that world? I think 9 times out of 10 people advocate for things they wouldn't actually want to live in that world that they're advocating for.
The way I would look at this is that the left and right at the level of mainstream politics are both reactions to neoliberalism. And it's often difficult for people on the left, especially, to kind of grasp this. If you talk to a lot of people who are narrowly only into left politics and they see things from a kind of left perspective as opposed to a general socialist or general, you could say class conscious perspective, but from a left perspective, because that's something that's actually very new in history, this idea of left as a brand in itself. You really think it's quite interesting that on the right, very rarely do you find anyone who says, I'm a rightist. It's hard to identify what that even is. On the right, there's libertarians, there's these NRX types, there's Trumpists, there's white nationalists, there's libertarians, there's people across the aisle, and they'll usually identify themselves as such. Whereas people on the left, they will often be specific too, but it is much more common to refer to oneself as a leftist than it is a rightist. In fact, there's a kind of whole set of ideas and aesthetics associated with this idea of left. It's kind of like a brand. People who get into that brand tend to have a very narrow way of seeing things and not see that at the level of politics, the right is also in many ways reacting to neoliberalism. Now, that doesn't mean that the politicians who rhetorically appeal to people who are feeling disenchanted with the current order are earnestly proposing any solutions. That is not what I'm saying. In fact, I actually think on usually both sides of the aisle, they tend to continue more or less of the same, especially with the conservative parties. However, you can't look at Reagan. Like, this is what's fascinating about Reaganism. Reaganism, while, ultimately ushering in neoliberalism, even though it had begun before at the level of policy, was also appealing to reactions against it. Now, that is going to be a little bit of a mind-boggling thing for a lot of people who think of like Reaganism as unequivocally a neoliberal. But, people forget why Reagan was so popular. It's that he appealed to ultimately conservative values in a way that presidents did not before. And the reason why these conservative values became popular is because people began to cherish things as they're dying out or have already died out. People romanticize things when they're already missed. They're already a thing of the past. And one of those things is the decline of the family. And you could also say the decline of the community. Now, that is very much a product of neoliberalism. This is the paradox of having women enter the workforce, right? Is it's on the one hand good for liberation because, women less dependent on men. And ultimately, it is the structural economic dependence that constitutes patriarchy. At the same time, if you have, women entering the workforce without a social safety net and low costs of living, that it makes it easier to have families, what you get is a whole bunch of absentee parenting where parents simply don't have the time to be there. And you also have way more relationship difficulties.
It's great for the daycare economy, though.
Right.
Come on, see the bright side, man. It's job creation.
Right. Or maybe it's good because the decline of the family is good, right? Because there's also
Or
the
you get
side,
two taxable incomes too.
there's a side of the left, right? There is a side of the left that takes what is currently happening and says that's good, actually. And that is another example of like a type of politics that is kind of also product of the zeitgeist, which is, to say what is happening, let's embrace it, let's affirm it. Or if it's an unself-aware way to say, let's abolish the family, even though, or that this is a goal of socialism, even though it seems to be happening under capitalism. Now, I don't want to get too much into that debate, but I will just say to clarify my views before all the family abolitionists type in the comments to say, read this, read that. Okay, I'm very well aware that the nuclear family itself already was the decline of the family. So the nuclear family was a regression, a capitalist regression from the community. The community is the kind of pre-capitalist way in which you have communities organized, still exists to this day to some extents, right? From there, you have like the nuclear family, where it's like two-parent households, kind of living in a box in a neighborhood where you are not that close to your neighbors, where you would not trust your neighbors taking care of your kids, where you would in a community.
And they got to get
So
out
it's
when they're 18 and make their own way.
right. So it's a regression, like, but we have something even kind of worse than that happening, where it's like the divorce rates have skyrocketed, and you have ultimately a decline of two-parent households, and also just simply like the time in which parents they are able to be there for their children is less. You have all these burdens, so you have a bundle of contradictions. You have a bunch of social freedoms that weren't there before, but under an economy that constrains this freedom at the level of time energy in the economy, it ultimately totally constrains human community and human life. I mean, that's families, that's a huge part of that. Parenting is a gigantic part of the process in which we develop, obviously should be self-evident. And when right wingers bemoan the loss of the family, I mean, at the level of like voters, regular people, you can't just say that those people are just, missing the days in which like gay people had no rights or that women had no rights. A lot of people do genuinely care about family values without the, baggage that sometimes comes with that term. Some people
Yeah,
do use it as a dog whistle, but
can I
like,
interject really quick? Because this is the perfect, actually, example of kind of what I was asking.
mhm,
Is that, okay, so women can enter the workforce, women's liberation, that's all to the good. But then we see, again, not as a result of that, but as a result of the same underlying process, that
mhm,
basically you get this further atomization of
right.
the family disintegrating. What I find just as an inadequate response is the right wingers will say, okay, the answer is to just go back to when women didn't work or vote.
Right.
The left wingers,
Well, yeah, on
though,
the extreme, yeah, on the
right, on
extreme.
the extreme, on the extreme.
Some will like that's the thing about the right, right? All reactionaries have a kind of scale, and some of it, I think, all of them are kind of inadequate. Actually, all of them are kind of they could miss the mark. But like you have, yeah, of course, on the far right, you have like let's return to the time where women didn't vote, or then you have some who want to return to like pre-abortion rights, some who wants to go to no-fault divorce, which that was pretty recent. Like that's wouldn't be that big of a walk back, or some just like some people were totally cool with everything until the trans stuff, and then they were like, oh, I don't know about progressivism. Okay, you said is the inadequacy of the right.
Yeah, but in addition to that, it's like, okay, but then you, like you brought up, the left wingers say like decline of the family is good, right? And that's kind of like the other, again, a fringe idea, but that's also a really stupid response. What
Right.
I'm kind of wondering is like, does anyone have a vision for how we keep the gains of social progression but move beyond, like, reconstitute the family? Because like that's,
Sure.
to me, the issue is that I don't see a vision of that even exists. But sorry, I interrupted, but that's, I just wanted to clarify, that's really what I'm asking. Like that micro example is a really good like encapsulation of it.
No, it's a good question. I think there are people who think in a direction that I would say maybe if not provide solutions, at least gets us closer to that. But to do that, you have to, I think, understand we have to like understand the actual thing that's happening in order to put forth a solution. I really do think that because with the right, why I think the right's so inadequate. And I think the best example of as to why conservatism, like itself, just conservatism as an ideology, does not solve the problem. It's Putin's Russia. So Putin's Russia is almost like ideologically the perfect example of conservatism not working. because, at the level of rhetoric, at the level of, appeals, Putin's, at least since, 2011, has been very socially conservative in his rhetoric. That, in fact, that's kind of how he defines Russia's identity, as opposed to the West. It's the decadent liberal West versus the traditional East. And some people, on the right, like to fetishize Russia for this reason. The thing about Russia, though, is that, like, if you look at what's happening in Russia, none of this is actually working. The emigration rate is just as bad. People are leaving the country. It's has a net, like, it has a demographic crisis. It still has a birth rate crisis that's terrible, really bad birth rate crisis. In fact, it's not that much better than a lot of the liberal Western countries. So it's, you clearly just telling women to be more trad doesn't like make them have more kids. Like it just doesn't really work that way. And it's funny because that's what Xi Jinping and the shift in China, which is sort of like a shift economically left but socially right. We'll see if it works. I have a feeling it won't, but they are trying to like bring back Confucianism because they're very freaking out about how to deal with the demographic crisis of low birth rates and stuff.
Yeah, are there like
And
guys on Chinese Twitter with like Confucius classical paintings in their avatar, the way we have Greek statue guys here? I wonder.
I wonder that would, I mean, yeah, I wouldn't surprise me. I wouldn't surprise me. I mean, look, you tend to see a lot of the same problems that happen in a lot of countries happen in other countries that have similar levels of development. And one of those things is the gender divide. We can get into that maybe
Right, it's
later.
almost like the level of development is more important than the outward ideology in many respects.
Right, and the ideology often kind of comes out of those conditions, and I mean that's the materialist view. And I don't even think this is, in a sense, I have a Marxist influence. It's really that I'm mostly a materialist. I'm not really a doctrinaire Marxist in the sense at all, but I'm a materialist, and that's I guess the sense that I'm Marxist. But like, I don't really think you have to be a Marxist to be a materialist. You know well, like people like Theodor Turchin are materialists. Ibn Khaldun was a materialist in many ways. I mean, Zizek thinks Hegel is a materialist, and that's
Well, that's insane, but anyway.
yeah, you'll have to see his case for that. But yeah, so I bring up Putin's Russia just because it is a very much a example of like the type of politics a lot of people on the right want, and they've had that for a long time, and it hasn't actually solved any of the issues that they claim to want to solve. And ultimately, yeah, because it is so much of it is just economics. Ideology is important, but you can't fix the problem with the ideology first. And then the economics, just ignore that or expect it to come after somehow. On the left, okay, what I don't want is an ideal movements on the left that are products of the zeitgeist and ultimately don't give people answers to like the real issues they face and ultimately accentuate the worst things that are already going on or try to rationalize things that are going on as being somehow emancipatory. And look, I think a lot of the reaction against, you could say, social progressivism, some of it is misinformed, some of it is misdirection. But, when it's happening in all these countries, you really have to think if so many people are reacting against social progress, can everyone really be that stupid? And I think a part of the reaction against social progress has to do with the fact that there's a fundamental discontinuity between the rhetoric of the left and the reality of the majority of people. And that is that while there are a lot of people who might not have had issues with social progressivism, it becomes very easy to pit you could call the common heteronormative majority, the silent conservative majority, as sometimes people like Nixon and Reagan would call it, against the fringe, the more, you could say, the outcasts, although not even the outcasts, because that's
The woke, you could say the woke.
it's difficult because the problem is I'm trying to say, like, where do you put women in this? Because this is the issue with the rhetoric. The left sometimes puts women in the same category as like oppressed groups, as like the races and disabled people. But like within the category of women, it's so diverse. Like you have class differences, and you have racial differences, which fundamentally, like, you cannot put women as like a fundamental category. And this is part of it's like saying men as a category. It's
Sure.
very absurd. The left will always say like this policy hurts the vulnerable people the most, and it'll say like among the vulnerable, they'll say racial minorities, disabled people, trans, and women. And I think that's why you have such a visceral reaction from like out of all the people, like younger men, and also especially the white men, because like they're kind of thinking like, wait, women as a whole are oppressed. What do you mean? Like there's so much women I know are making more money than I do, going to college more than I do, becoming part of the professional managerial class. So you get, it's very easy to stoke resentment there. And this is kind of what I mean, is that a lot of the ideology that makes up what we call the quote unquote left, what we might call like maybe hard leftists will call the woke left, the liberal left, whatever. But the point is, at the level of mainstream politics, what is seen as the left by the majority of people tends to champion a set of politics that does not align with the realities of a lot of people. And that is this politics that is ultimately still using rhetoric of the old world, which is, we're trying to fight the patriarchy, we're trying to fight for these groups, but the reality is that anyone with eyes can see that like countries like in Canada and the United States are not living in like the kind of Don Draper patriarchal world where like women have to be housewives and they have to be dependent on men. It's just we're in a fundamentally different world. And that is not to say that, to roll back the wheel of progress, but I think a lot of people become, especially like the younger white men types, become very resentful when, at the level of politics, the group that is supposed to be representing the oppressed is, ultimately like acting like working class men, or men regardless of class, if they're white, are ultimately a privileged group, whereas men, regardless of race and class, are a disadvantaged group. When that does not align with reality. So what I'm saying here is that it is very easy to stoke up resentment politics. And I think the politics of the right are the most resentment based, more than anything. And they are able to do that easily because ultimately, a lot of what, is in left politics does not match up with the reality. And that's not just because the people who make up the left are like stupid or something and are out of touch. They're out of touch, but it's not because they're like bad at marketing. They're out of touch because they actually just are coming from a different sociological position. They're coming largely from universities. They're coming from a very different socialization. And when you have, let's say, if imagine you're a woman who's a professional career woman coming out of university and wants to get a good job, you are promised gender equality and you want the same equality as men. Yet you see that at the top layers of like the levels of executives, CEOs, at the top layers of society, it's still predominantly, ultimately men who dominate. You feel like, the progress isn't done. So you want to push for more equality. Understandably, from your position, you feel like you haven't quite made it yet. Women haven't had enough success because there's still ultimately like most CEOs are men. Most of the richest people in the world are still predominantly men, and there is a real wage gap at the top. Yet at the professional class, that is totally not the case. It's almost like there's way more women actually now in universities than there are men. And the professional managerial class, or if you want to use that term, quite simply, what we could just say, due to the educational imbalance that's forming, women are able to outcompete men for professional jobs. And now you have like this kind of like disgruntled class of professional and managerial class who understandably feel like there still is like gender inequality at the top. Yet on the bottom, you have like these men who totally are not resonating at all with the rhetoric of PMC leftists who are saying how women are an oppressed group and like white men are not. And you get like ultimately a politics of resentment from, the what passes for the left and the right of resentment. But ultimately, like I would say, it's ultimately resentment's more from the right, and the left kind of mirrors it by just making it easy.
Yeah, I think the left is more bad conscience driven than resentment driven. I think the right is really, as Deleuze said, that the important thing with Nietzsche's analysis of slave morality is not that he connected resentment to bad conscience, but that he drew a distinction between them. That they're actually very different. They come from the same thing in some sense. You could say a lot of it is like, yeah, at the most basic psychological level, people feel powerless and they're trying to attribute some, like source of their suffering or something like that. And yeah, it's going to be the group that feels like they're having something taken away from them that is going to probably be a little more resentful about it. But I see like a lot of the left wing, this is maybe like the issue that where people do blame postmodernism and critical theory are a lot of the things that the ideas you're kind of talking about are like the social progressives who feel like the work is never done, particularly the types who feel like they perceive the ways in which they've done very well in the system, but they understand what the system is based on. Which, by the way, somebody like Foucault you mentioned earlier, the reason why I would think he's very useful is like, I think it's very useful to be aware of power relationships as like relations of authority, and the fact that our society is so good at obfuscating them. And
Interesting.
that's really, like one of the great uses I think of postmodernism too is also an analyzing where the viewpoint comes from and consider the source, which I think when it's stated that way, most people agree with that, right? They just don't like it when it's weaponized, where it's like, you can't have that opinion because you're a white man, right? When it takes that form, it's not a good argument, right? Just shouting out like what somebody's bias is. Well, we all know that people with a bias can still be right. So you still have to actually have the argument, take on the argument, even if you point out the bias. It's not sufficient just to point out bias and be done with it. And I think that whole thing, we could argue to the extent, to what extent that's actually real, like, or if it's just like a caricature. But that is how people tend to see that whole thing. And it's why I think it's often, again, blamed for a lot of what you say, like the left sucks now. Like they've gotten caught up in this whole thing. But again, as you say, like,
I think it's real. That's what I mean. What I'm trying to say is that these things aren't
right,
just
sure.
features of ideology. They're kind of like sociological due to the educational divide, ultimately.
Yeah, well, but I guess, yeah, it's an educational divide, but I think you touched on something, that there is something like, by bringing in resentment with it, there's something temperamentally going on as well, where people who have like a similar level of economic status could either affirm their position in the meritocracy and say that this was all based on fair competition, I earned this. Not just myself, too. That's the thing. People will on the left often portray this like it's like the moral thing would be the other side to say, yeah, I'm going to be a class traitor. This is a system of exploitation, and nobody deserves to be above this. They would say that's like you're willing to sacrifice material status for a moral position. The other position is being more materialistic. But really, no, there's a moral element in the right wing side, too, right? Like, they would see it morally as like, you should be like grateful for what your society's done for you. That's a common talking point from conservatives. You should just be happy you have an iPhone, and you should be thankful to live in, like, and they really take that as a sort of like a moral thing. Like, I should be grateful to my country. I should be grateful to the system that gave me this. And so that, like, you could have two people that come from even the same background. I think the reason why being college educated is going to skew more towards the left side of things is it is going to be because you're going to be exposed to a heightened awareness of the exploitation in the system. Maybe you could say the conservatives would say they're brainwashing them or whatever. That's also just going to be everyone in your milieu is going to think that way. So you're just going to be exposed to more. I think it's going to select for people of that psychological temperament who are more willing to not self-identify with their own tribe, something like that. Maybe be more universalist. Maybe they're not going to see the moral imperative as being grateful to the system. They're going to see all the ways in which there's some sort of unfairness to it. Yeah, I think ultimately, as you say, they're both kind of unproductive. They don't really get you anywhere. I think that's the malaise that a lot of people feel too, without like, and it's why I feel like I'm like totally politically unmoored and because I don't, again, it's like that thing I talked about before. It's like I don't see any sort of through line
Solution
that leads from either one of those psychological orientations towards anything productive. And like, as you say, ideologically, I don't think that you get anywhere by promoting some new ideology or challenging them on the level of ideology. And I'm also have very little faith in the democratic process. It is interesting. Like, I think you're correct that the right is more resentful, but I think the left, it unlocks Nietzsche's analysis of slave morality, like, is rarely applied in that way. Usually the right wingers say the left is resentful. I think that's the other way around. The right's resentful, the left has bad conscience.
There's resentment all across the aisle.
Sure, that's true.
I think it's just the reason I invoke it with the right is to say, well,
it's all grievance. Everything is grievance.
A lot of the right doesn't genuinely want to roll back like all women's rights, all of that. It's ultimately, resentment politics, which is stemming from a discontinuity. I mean, could you imagine you're struggling and ultimately it is the side that's supposed to represent like the oppressed groups is saying that you're actually a privileged group. And it's a bunch of like, this is why people really think they really think like AOC not being liked compared to Bernie is a result solely of sexism. And
Yeah.
people who say that I think really don't understand what is really going on there. What they don't like is they don't like to see a college master's graduate, lecture them and in a way that feels like they're being talked down to, especially when their side isn't being heard. Although I will say with AOC, she has made a much better effort recently to kind of I guess de-wokeify her politics. At the end of the day, she was always better than most of the Democrats. I'll give her credit. Like, I mean, she has won votes of Trump supporters, and this sometimes surprises people that like there were people in her district who voted for her in New York who had voted for Trump in the federal election. If you ask like a liberal leftist who is more oppressed, a Latina woman with a master's degree or a white man without a college degree, they would probably say the white man without the college degree is more privileged. At the economic level, that this is probably not true. And it does open up all these rabbit holes. If we're to play politics of who is more oppressed and who is not, which is a really bad way to talk about politics to begin with, first off, it opens all these like rabbit holes. I mean, Norman Finkelstein had this funny moment when he was talking about anti-Semitism, and he said he was kind of dismissing the extent to which like anti-Semitism is a serious structural problem in America. And he was saying like, first off, is there real actual barriers here? There's way more barriers to ugly people than there are to like any minority for that matter, let alone Jewish people. And I mean, he made it as a joke, but he was really making a powerful point there, which is like, if you're going to play these oppression Olympics, there are a myriad of categories that can be opened up. And I think we got to go back to like Marx here, which is, why did Marx stress the working class? It's not because he thought they were the most oppressed. It's not because he thought they were inherently good in some moral sense either. He chose a working class as opposed to the peasantry, as opposed to the lumpen proletariat, aka the kind of illegal gray market workers, like drug dealers, prostitutes, etc. He took the working class because not only did they have the self-interest in actually advocating for a new, better system, unlike the bourgeoisie, who previously were the revolutionary class in the feudal aristocratic and mercantilist order, and were now under the capitalist order, the new ruling class. They didn't have the interest, the proletariat working class did, but they also had the power. That's the big thing. They had the organizational power because they were ultimately the class of people most vital to the creation of value, to the creation of the products, to the creation of the things that make the world go round. And because of that power, they had the power to organize and to actually make a change. It's that power that actually matters. Now, this is actually why I think Marxism, in a certain way, is way less viable in the way that it used to be, precisely due to the structural decline of the working class, due to the global neoliberal system and exploitation of third world labor and outsourcing of factories, etc. It's still relevant. Ultimately, a category for politics needs, if the politics is to be more than a set of talking points, a set of brands for people to attach themselves to, but something with a change, there has to be like a material basis of power there in which you have a coalition of different people who have some shared goal. Whereas the left today is obsessed with making people agree on a set of things. But that was never really what politics was about. And that's especially, I think, unlikely in the kind of world we're in now, where it's, you much more easy to express political differences through the internet.
Do you think that has something to do with democracy as such, or like this current iteration of democracy, that people are so concerned with beliefs of others on like a laundry list of issues?
You might find this interesting. So I have this paper. I want to make it into the video essay at some point, but I have too many other projects. But I have the rough short version of it on my Patreon, and I can send it like a PDF to you. I have a hypothesis of like what wokeism is as a politics, and I don't think it has anything to do with the left or right. There's left and right versions, and I think it simply has to do with woke politics is a style of politics that puts the awakening of consciousness first, as opposed to shared interests.
Oh, interesting. That
So
is
Paul,
interesting. Okay.
yeah, and this guy take it literally. I mean, like, if you look at the etymology of the word woke, it's the idea that, if we just awaken people, enough people to come to our side, we get awakened to the correct ideas, then we'll change things. And I view it all as like an anti-political politics
It is kind of the
because
way like the red pill in the right wing in a way.
red pill, yeah, red pill is a form of right-wing wokeism.
Wow, that's fun. Okay, wow, interesting.
I think the first form of right-wing wokeism is evangelical Christianity.
Hmm.
That's part of the hypothesis, which is, and then literally with this first and second great awakenings, because evangelical Christianity really does take
Yeah,
off in America the most.
yeah. That's I didn't even think about that. The Great Awakening. It's literally in the name. I wonder what James
Yeah.
Lindsay will have to say about that.
Well, yeah, I wonder, because the thing about James Lindsay is he's a weird figure. He's also embodies the problems we criticize about Peterson, but he's not like totally stupid sometimes. But I'll say this about wokeism. So like with evangelical Christianity, what makes it very different from Catholicism, but even other forms of Protestantism, is that it is ultimately about your beliefs that matter, not your practices. Like it's all about, do you believe in Christ? And it's about the people with the set of shared beliefs. It's really the consciousness that is put forth before the actual practice and ritual.
And that explains the sectarianism of it as well. Is
Yes.
like these
And the
micro
fanaticism.
disagreements. Yeah.
Oh,
I
yes.
just talked to my friend Neil, Gnostic Informant, and he was saying that he was part of like a King James only church where they literally think, Catholics are going to hell because they read the wrong translation of the Bible. They don't read the one made in like 1610.
What's fascinating also about evangelical Christianity is that unlike Catholicism or even a lot of other strands of, like let's say Baptist Protestantism, evangelical Christianity, part of what makes it different is like you have to come to the awakening yourself. Being baptized you're not, it's not like you're being baptized at a young age is enough, or to just be born of the religion. You actually have to come to this conclusion yourself, literally having an awakening. And that's kind of, the big crux of it, as opposed to more pragmatic approach, which is to say, let's facilitate social cohesion. If we all, go to church, blah blah blah, get married, yeah, yeah. I mean, ultimately, like what religion's real purpose is kind of more pragmatic at the level of human evolution. It's just facilitating social cohesion. But evangelical Christianity is fascinating because it does put like consciousness first, but at the same time, it does have at the level of like who does have produce the most at the level of like birth rates. It is the evangelicals, but Mormons also produce a lot too. But that's a whole other debate if you want to get into the rabbit hole that is birth rates. I bring this evangelical part. When I made this connection is because when I was searching for books on wokeism on Z Library, there was this book written by a evangelical right winger called "Awake but Not Woke," or yeah, it was written by a Christian right winger, and it was called "Awake but Not Woke," and it was like a polemic against wokeism, but it was promoted like, but it was polemic was against all of like, the things we associate with left wing wokeism at the level of politics and issues. Like it was just against basically progressivism, but it was saying actually we should support an awakening, the correct awakening, and that is Jesus. So I thought I made that connection there because I thought I was like fascinating. So that's when I went back into the Great Awakening and all that and looked at the etymology of the term, because I think what is the common denominator of woke politics? Starting with the left but also taking it to the right. It's really confusing if you try to associate particular things, because if you say cancel culture, identity politics, these are just very particular aspects of it, but they don't actually have much in common. Like, how would you tie? And also, it makes it seem like, is black politics inherently woke? I don't think so, actually. Is progressive politics inherently woke? I don't think so. What ties like the style of woke politics, which ultimately at the level of pure intuition, people tend to have a sense of what it is. If you ask like regular people, and like I don't know, when I say regular people, people who are just not politically is like obsessed, they'll often like point to things, and it's often has to do with etiquette. A style of like politics that is all about, did you say the right thing? Do you appear the right way? It's all about style, and it's all about like style that gives an indication as to what you believe, but it's not very pragmatic at the level of forming alliances, because any politics that would be serious would want to reach across the aisle, not trying to purify everybody, not trying to make sure everyone believes the right thing. Politics is ultimately to do with the polis, the political community. And that means a bunch of people who have disagreements and are going to always have disagreements to some extent, regardless, unless you want a totalitarian society, and that never even works. So, there's going to be disagreements coming together and agreeing on some shared interests. And left politics prior to the new left, but then again, the new left isn't like the cause of the decline, it's a symptom of it, was about like ultimately a politics based on a common interest of based on economics. And if you look at right-wing politics, even I guess if you want to call like Trumpism, it's ultimately like a coalition of totally different people, but unified under a demagogue and unified against what they see as the left. So
You
it's
could
like
even
a sort of
argue against neoliberalism, at least rhetorically, if not in
rhetorically in
substance.
spirit. Yeah, to some extent. I mean, but that's the thing. They're arguing against one part of neoliberalism, which
But that's
is
why it's so funny because they'll what people call communism or capitalism from opposite angles. People will call the same thing like like
right. Yeah, yeah. Mary
yeah,
Taylor
yeah.
Greene.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's very interesting, and it also explains why you're. I've seen like a lot of discontent recently, where people are saying, online, oh, the anti-woke are getting just as obnoxious as the woke. But really, what you're pointing to is that they're actually the exact same. It's just
They
that,
are woke. Yeah, the right
yeah,
wing
their
wokes.
their form of wokeism is like they're telling you like, okay, the reason why your life is not as good is because these people with these woke ideas are in positions of power
Right.
like trying to keep you down because of your identity.
Right.
So
Yeah.
it's
Like all the
it's
men are been brainwashed by feminism and liberal, blah blah blah. And if once the men wake up,
or it's
uh,
the cathedral.
or well, there's like to be fair, within all these constellations, there's contradictions in all of them. Like obviously, like there's the incel variant, which would just be about like men waking up and whatever. And then there'd be like the kind of broader right wing, which is like, there's the red pill for women, for instance. Like there's that whole like thing, but it's ultimately a woke politics because they believe like if you break free from this liberal mind prison, and people realize it, somehow this will change, somehow the economy will change, somehow it'll be easier to have kids, right? Like there's not much thought behind this, but that's ultimately like consciousness based politics is ultimately about like substituting one ideology for another to obfuscate the contradictions and give a kind of like bedtime story.
To go back to the new left then. So that's the thing is that they make that shift to the reason why we haven't been able to have Marxism is because there hasn't been the entire theory of developing class consciousness was wrong. I mean, I agree with you. They're not really to blame. I think a lot of the modern activist types or like woke left, woke right, or whatever types. I mean, let's be honest. The majority of them haven't read any of this stuff. Like it's not actually the intellectual roots of the tradition that is doing any work over their minds. I
Oh
think it is a
no, yeah.
temperamental issue, kind of like we were bringing up, and it's like you said, it's a series of signifiers. And I have my own ideas on this. Like, I really think that what really matters in determining group identity in the modern world is the way that you talk, less so than how you look or physical appearance, ethnicity, even, or even like national origins. Now,
Right, yeah,
a lot of those things like affect the way that you talk. But like there
sure.
is something that we kind of do even on an intuitive, unconscious level when speaking to someone else of kind of assessing their lexicon and just the
Hmm.
way that they frame things and determining whether they're in the group with us or not.
Hmm.
And I think that drives a lot of this as well, is that these memes travel through people with a certain temperament in a certain social milieu. So like the left social milieu is going to skew towards more college educated. College towns are what more young people. There's more youth there. There's going to be more experimentation and anti-authoritarianism and etc. And so then they're going to talk a certain way, and that's going to mimetically travel and establish the group on the basis of that. And you'll have like the whole other version of that for, say, rural people who are not college educated and so on and so forth.
Well,
But
you
go on.
mentioned about Rock Hill. So one thing I forgot to add with Rock Hill, and you reminded me there that like okay, so when people who look at people like Deleuze or Foucault or whoever, which Deleuze is not a postmodernist, that's another kind of misnomer, but to look at postmodern thinkers, or at least people of that epoch, as the causes or lineage of a broader movement that either brainwashed people or just made them, not have the right leftism that distracted people from Marxism. I mean,
They were
so
funded by the CIA.
right, right. So the funny thing about that is like, I mean, what people like Gabriel Rockhill, who's like a perpetuator of this sort of narrative, leave out always is I mean, why did so many people jump ship from Marxism? They jump ship from Marxism is because already Marxism was totally diluted by Stalinism. When Marxism became Stalinism and was, turned into Marxism, Leninism in the Soviet Union, it was already split into like multiple camps. There was the non-Marxists, non-Marxist, Leninist, Marxists, and there was the Trotskyists who were still Leninists but not MLs. And then you had the true believers, the people who were Marxist Leninists. One of those people was like, Jean-Paul Sartre, for example. Thing is like most of those people jumped ship, starting with the Khrushchev secret speech, which revealed what the fuck was going on. Because before that, people need to remember how many Marxists or anyone with like socialist communist sympathies were actually very pro Soviet Union. Even Einstein was. And actually, it's something like, tanky type people like to bring it up this quote out of context from Einstein where he like praises Stalin. And the thing is so did Roosevelt actually, and so did like John Oppenheimer. So did a lot of people back then because that was before like the secret speech, before people knew what the fuck was going on. Already after that wave of the secret speech, there was a lot of disenchantment and people jumped ship. Now, what was ultimately the invasions of Hungary and Czechoslovakia, the brutal crushings of any attempts to reform socialism to something more humane, where that totally made people jump ship from Marxism, Leninism, and because of that, Marxism became taboo itself. It became even more taboo than it already was because there's also the Red Scare and all that, which made Marxism very hard to sympathize with. And due to the McCarthyism, you had it so like all the sympathizers to actually succeed had to like call themselves something else.
So that wait, this is what okay, well, sorry, go on.
So
I
what I
just
just mean is the decline of Marxism was due to like very real things, and it's not due to these postmodern types. The postmodern types come out of the death of Marxism. That is because it's already died. It didn't cause it, right? They like emerge out of the death. Now, I would critique a lot of the postmodern turn. The only postmodern thinker I think is still relevant is Baudrillard. I mean, not still, like all of them are still relevant in their own ways, but the only one I think is still like quote unquote right is Baudrillard. And my critique of like Deleuze or Foucault is not that they caused any sort of whatever or that they're to blame for the decline of Marxism or something. It's that I just don't think like when I read, for example, Foucault or when I read Deleuze's anti-Oedipus, okay, I don't find like that the vision of politics they advocate at all resonates with the current zeitgeist. In fact, it's almost as if they're describing the current zeitgeist, but like with socialist twists, in the sense that like they're talking about the liberation of desire and it's this anti-bureaucratic view. Whereas I feel like for a lot of people in our world today, we want to be like protected from what we want. We don't want more like we have too much we're being advertised to all the time. We have too much consumerism. We have too much things vying for our desire, too much almost hedonism. So you have this like move almost like towards a social austerity, but at the same time, not like at the level of like having less money, but at the level of we almost want like something to discipline us, which is why I think people gravitate to authoritarian figures. I think ultimately people like Byung-Chul Han or Zizek much more present something that resonates with me and a lot of people like today. Whereas, I read like Deleuze or Foucault, I feel like they're writing in a time where like there's still all these shackles on the things that they're trying to that don't exist in like our current society anymore. Like for example, when Deleuze and Foucault are writing, Charles de Gaulle is the leader of France, and de Gaulle is like essentially running a command economy capitalism. Like he's running planned capitalism with huge bureaucratic structures, and France doesn't even get the like women don't even get the right to vote till like the mid 60s. I think it's before 68, but they still get the right to vote very late. In France, like they also get divorce rights late. They get let alone gay rights is like totally my way later before their time, like way after their time. I mean, like being gay is still super like taboo. Gay marriage is far from being recognized. It's not hard to see like why what they're reacting to is something kind of different from what we have in our society. My thing with these type of thinkers is that the politics they position, which is ultimately, Foucault is I'll leave out Foucault here and put Deleuze because Foucault's politics are subject to a lot of debate if you really want to get into that. Because some people say he's actually becomes a neoliberal before he dies, like a real
yeah,
neoliberal, like in a serious sense. Whereas
right.
Deleuze's Guattari are ultimately communists till they die.
Well,
Uh,
sure, but that people will point out that there's a complete absence of class in
Complete
books
absence of
like
class.
Anti-Oedipus.
Yeah, a complete. That's the thing. That's why I think their politics is
And
ultimately sucks balls because
to
there's a
steal,
complete there's a complete absence of class. It's all about like decentralized movements without a head.
can I
Struggle
give
from
the
now is the opposite. We struggle from like two movements being too decentralized, a lack of structure in our lives, actually a lack of authority, dare I say. In fact, I
yeah,
think there's a
there's
crisis of authority. Like what paradox of capitalism is broken down like every authority structure in human society, not every, but like a lot of structures, except like the boss and the employee and
yeah,
like the structures at the level of the economy and domination. Or you could even say it's breaking that down too with like the gig economy, maybe, and that's maybe not a good thing because now we're the masters of our own exploitation.
right. Yeah, we all own our own means of production, which are our bodies. I mean, okay, I'll give a brief defense of Deleuze, or okay, no, actually, I want to take this on in terms of in broad strokes. I'm not trying to defend the New Left, by the way, or critical theory or postmodernism or any of this in terms of like that's the way that people should think. I don't actually follow them like the actual postmodernists. I see their approach as more of a toolkit to use or like a certain lens, or like an ideological lens even that can be really useful. The reason I think why they turned away from, say, Deleuze and Guattari from class analysis, and this is really what I wanted to ask you earlier. So with Marx setting the proletariat as like the revolutionary class, right? That was more than 150 years ago. Things have changed dramatically. That was part of like grappling this like turn to making change in the level of cultural consciousness is their way of trying to, I mean, I think this is widely accepted. I'm not saying anything like super unorthodox here as far as how a lot of people feel about that whole turn. Okay, this hasn't worked. We need to like maybe the issue is like culture, right? And then you've talked about how this like ties in with like the woke idea. We need to awaken everyone or something like that. The reason why they're addressing that whole situation is because the fundamental like material conditions had changed. Like I think they're actually right about that. Like you can't trust the working class. Like it
Mhm.
turns out that what actually happens to the working class under like American capitalism, well, they become a consumer economy. They get all these cheap goods, and a lot of them actually really like that and will be grateful, as we talked about earlier. Like a lot of people will adopt that mindset. You now have this idea, a lot of people, I think they talk about the professional managerial class the way they do because it was almost like presented like that's going to be the revolutionary class now. And that's not a
Mhm.
revolutionary class either. That
Mhm.
and on a broader point, I think like what Marcuse, I keep going back to him, even though he's one of my least favorite of these figures. But I think what
Mhm.
he was correct about, there is like a kind of marriage of capitalism and socialism. I mean, you even talked about it like with the command economy in France and like that being a
Mhm.
very specific moment. I would argue that in many ways, you could say we live under a command economy now. Like, and libertarians do make that critique. And I think they're correct to some extent with the number of levers that
Mhm.
the government has to like
I would actually say the opposite, in that we
mm,
suffer from a decline of state capacity at the level of being able to manage affairs. We do have like I think we have like corporate kind of planned
well,
economies in the sense we have like bureaucracy. We have bureaucracy. Yeah,
well,
I
I think
do
the
agree with
state
that.
is has become inseparable or inextricable from capital is part of the issue. Like
In that,
it's
I think capital dominates the state more than ever, I would
well, see,
say.
but I don't even think that distinction is all that meaningful. Trying to decide which one is dominating the other,
I think
I
it
feel
is.
like that
I think
returns
it's.
us to like an ideological dispute. When what I'm trying to get at here, like really briefly, and I'll kick it over to you, is that I think the distinction between capitalism and socialism has been steadily dissolved over the last number of decades. That's why you can kind of it's like a Rorschach test. You could see it from the libertarian standpoint of like this is crony capitalism, and the problem is we need to have a real free market where people can compete. Or people on the left who will say it's been captured by capital, right? And all the billionaires run like fund all the candidates and blah blah blah. But what they're both seeing and describing in these different terms is this like convergence of capital and state power. Because like as you said, if it dissolves all the authority other than the authority of the boss, right? Like yeah, the state ends up being I guess the enforcement of that authority and nothing else. Like there's no other values driving the state than that. And I don't think that in a way you could say it hasn't been even that different historically. Like that's sort of like returning us to, and that was like a big critique that a lot of the new left was making. Like I'm reading Dialectic of Enlightenment right now with Adorno and Horkheimer, and they're basically saying like the Enlightenment sublated itself; it's becoming a myth again, or like we're returning to mythic forms of human society. We never left, I guess you could say. But I don't want to necessarily go down that road. I think there has been a change. I think it did make sense. Like, I think we're still speaking in language from 150 years ago when we invoke pure capitalism or pure socialism, which I think are basically Platonic forms that have never existed. But at least there was, like, as you say, there was like a material reality at a certain point in time where it made sense to talk about like the proletariat organizing and gaining power. It seems like there's this convergence of the state and capital. I don't even know if it's like a meaningful distinction anymore.
So there's two things to address there. One is the capitalism and socialism distinction, and the other would be the proletariat. I want to get at that, the working class, whether that's even a viable category anymore. But first, with this, you know, convergence of the state and capital, I mean, you're totally right about that. In that, I mean, Sheldon Wolin, who I'm very influenced by in my book that is coming out, that I'm still finishing, is on inverted totalitarianism, characterizes the convergence and collaboration of state and capital as a big part of that order of inverted totalitarianism and the undoing of democracy. Yet I think, in fact, it is very much clearly more so capital dominating the state than the other way around. And it's, I think, due to the sheer extent to which capital increasingly dominates the state, especially in the likes of America, much more than in other democracies anyway. Although in some countries, the corporate state is also, it's just totally at the point where it's not democratic at all. Like, but most of the time, it's not countries we would consider democracies. So, like, Pakistan is like essentially a military oligarchy. Egypt's a military oligarchy. Or if you look at Russia, it's an oligarchy. It's an oligarchy, and nobody really considers these to be like legitimate democracies, even though they all have elections and rituals, democratic rituals and whatnot, constitutions. No one considers them legitimate democracies. People still consider America a legitimate democracy because it still has some degree of party competition, even though both of those parties have been totally swallowed up by corporate power completely and fully.
But
And
see,
there's
is it
some.
just corporate power? That's,
So,
I
well,
feel
I'd
like
say
that's kind of
it's
a limited.
well, the state is totally corporatized, but the reason why I do think it is crucial to emphasize the extent to which it is more capital dominating the state is because I think the definition of the extent to which democracy has declined is so vast that the bar for what constitutes the alternative, aka socialism, is also lowered considerably. It's to the point where a lot of, especially the Marxist Leninist types, will like to point to countries like China to say that's an alternative, because in China the state dominates capital. It's also in some ways a corporate state, but it's ultimately the state disciplining capital. Capital does not have the same power over like the ruling party is like the capital has over the Democrats or Republicans, and because of that, it is almost like lowered the bar for what was considered socialism, because I don't think that's socialism. That's just, even like old, I mentioned De Gaulle. De Gaulle did stuff like that, like disciplined capital. And in America, you had Teddy Roosevelt, like disciplined capital, FDR disciplined capital to some extent. These aren't like unheard of in a capitalist world, but because of how dominated politics is by corporations now, it's at the point where like what we consider the alternative is lowered, and you'll have people call like China socialist because, oh wow, they killed a billionaire, or they set rules that capital has to follow so that it benefits China. Oh wow, right? But at the end of the day, that's just more of a symptom of the fact that like things have gone so far in the likes of America to the point where people are really itching for anything that disciplines corporations whatsoever, and looking to that as a solution, when I feel like that's just uncreative. Like, it is fascinating to me that when Americans will look at like, they'll say, especially the people who consider themselves to be on the social democratic end, who will say they want a neo FDR. I'm thinking like, well, FDR wasn't even a social democrat. Like, that's a really low bar. FDR, unlike Olof Palme in Sweden, or unlike even Francois Mitterrand, or even unlike the current Portuguese government or the current Spanish government, was not a social democrat. FDR was, a corporatist in the old word, the sense of the word, which meant basically instead of having unions have most of the power, you essentially have the state force corporations to negotiate with state sanctioned unions. It's actually a model pioneered largely by fascist Italy, but it has like democratic variants. You can do it in a democratic state as well, like in Roosevelt's America. And in China, I would say, has a similar model actually, in that it's like the state facilitates a bargaining between the companies and workers. But the problem with that is that, if depending on what kind of state you have, that could be a regime that's good for workers or one that's actually worse for workers. Like Roosevelt was better for workers. For that context, Mussolini was worse for workers at the level of suppressing wages and stuff. But like, this is qualitatively different from social democracy, which social democracy comes out of the Marxist movement. It does. It's like the more moderate reformist wing of Marxist movement. It's fundamentally different from the corporatism. But what I'm just trying to say here, I kind of got off topic there, but the point that's related to is that the bar for what is considered an alternative was already low to begin with, and it's been lowered even more. I want to get at this proletariat question, because if anything is to change, regardless if it's a moderate change or a radical one, it requires some basis of power, unless we're going to rely solely on the goodwill of elites. That could happen. That could happen, by the way. Trump could do universal health care. It's possible. I doubt it, but it's possible.
He
If you
could
really,
probably get the Republicans behind healthcare.
I doubt it, honestly. That's the thing with the American system, is that like there's no party loyalty. So like even now Trump's having trouble passing like
Sure.
his budget, his like spending.
He could popularize it with the base. If he was like first term Trump and he did that, he might have the political capital to do it. But I was
Right.
thinking more in the way that like it took like Bill Clinton to do the largest slew of deregulation, sign NAFTA, you know? Like you kind of can get things done if you go against your base and you're really popular, or like the traditional orthodoxy in a way.
Yes. Yeah, even then though, dude, that's the thing about America, is it is just so hard to get anything done due to the constraints. It's fascinating because like I don't want to even get into that, but I talk about a lot about America in my book. It is genuinely like a very peculiar case in the world of democracy, because it's some of its most on paper democratic features are actually its least democratic features, at the level of making it impossible for any popular will to be exerted. And
I agree.
with the proletariat, was there a real reason to question that for the 70s thinkers who came out of the postmodern turn and all of that? Absolutely. However, I don't think we should throw the baby out with the bathwater, because what the left has substituted the working class with is like this, what I'll call the vulnerable. Catherine Liu likes to use this term a lot. And I think it tracks in the language that the left uses. And I say the left because I'm tired of leftists saying that all these things we criticize are really just liberals and not the left. Why else would liberal politicians use this kind of left coded language? It's to appeal to who? Leftists, which means that it's leftists who find that stuff appealing, or else why would they do it?
Yeah,
Right.
it's mostly an artificial distinction because they don't want to be saddled with it. It's honestly just like Republicans calling people rhinos. Like they're
Yeah. Oh,
not.
yeah. Like, yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. People want to distance themselves from power when it's not acting in ways that accord with their ideals. But throwing out the working class as a category, I'm not very convinced that it's been replaced by has been any better. It is a very fascinating question, and it's something I still struggle with, because people like Chris Catrone, on the one hand, who's like a sophisticated Marxist thinker, still believes in the category of working class. Someone like Benjamin Studebaker, who you mentioned, who I've had on my show very frequently, does not. Actually, my mentor in grad school, Saad Haider, very good critic of identity politics, actually also is a very big critic of the working class as a identity. That's not to say, there's no like class doesn't matter. That's not what any of them would say. It's that like the working class as a category, it's just not doesn't have that degree of structural power that it did to constitute a revolutionary force. What I would say is there's a lot of room still for a coalition of different people who might fall into a category that is somewhere close to the working class. Either they just earn their money from labor, you know, or even I think the petite bourgeoisie, this is my kind of controversial opinion, is I think what is called the petite bourgeoisie, small business owners, are actually a revolutionary class, or have the potential to be. They aren't like in any essence. They can be very reactionary, in fact, but they have the
Yeah, I was going
potential
to
to
say, I
be.
mean, you could argue that, well, I'll let you go on. Yeah, I think we've already seen that to some extent. Their
Oh,
discontent
plenty.
fueling. Yeah.
Yes, and I actually think in some ways they have more structural power actually than the working class do, due to the gigification of the working class. But I think there's a lot of room actually to still form coalitions based on interest. I mean, we don't necessarily need this like totalizing term like the working class to do it. We can still have like coalitions that still just mindfully can appeal to people of different classes. That doesn't mean you can appeal to class issues without just using words like the working class, because that doesn't actually capture everyone's experience. You can kind of use things in this term that I know a lot of orthodox Marxists hate, but like the haves and have nots. Or I honestly think the biggest contradiction now is actually between those who profit from rent and those who have to pay it. Like
Mm.
rent, those who are ultimately like tenants and landlords is actually in Canada, honestly, a bigger contradiction between workers and capitalists, in my view.
Well, and there's actually memes on the right now of people they think there's, social engineering to we'll have to rent everything. So that could actually bind even them together as part of a shared interest. But I do want to go back to something like what you mentioned with like FDR being a corporatist. And I largely agree with your analysis. I mean, the famous quote from FDR is that what he said is, I saved capitalism, right? I'm not bringing socialism, I'm saving capitalism. It's very telling then that a lot of people ostensibly on the left want to go back to FDR because again it goes back to this issue that I was kind of trying to get at earlier. Just placing yourself in the shoes of an American or a Canadian, really anybody in the developed Western world, all these consumer economies we've been talking about. Relatively speaking, in terms of all human history and in terms of the entire rest of the world, their position is pretty good in spite of all these issues. There's a real suspicion, right, that like, okay, all of you leftist revolutionary people or Marxians or whoever you might be, you're going to disturb that. Like, you're going to derail this train. Like, I love that movie Snowpiercer because it so speaks to. Have you seen that movie, the Korean film?
I actually have not. I've been recommended it. I've heard it's good.
Okay, I can't give this metaphor without spoiling the film. Are you okay with that?
You can
Or
do that. I'm
okay,
pretty open to spoilers. I'm
no,
definitely gonna
it's
watch it though.
yeah, it's not like a major. I mean, I guess it tells you what happens at the end, but the more interesting thing is like the character arcs and stuff. So it's fine. But I mean, the film is like a really nakedly a metaphor for society. Like we're all in this train together, but the people who bought their way on and paid the most are at the front of the train, and you get to more opulence the further front you go. The people in the back paid nothing and were let on basically just to save their lives because there was a global apocalypse, and they're like eating bugs and crammed together and have horrible living conditions. And they rise up and revolt, and the result is the train is derailed, right?
Mm.
So, and at no point do they try to present the people who are running the train, society, etc., as though what they've done is justified or that it's actually meritocratic and they should be grateful. Like it's presented really starkly that this is like oppression and inequality and totally unfair. It's almost like there's no other choice to maintain the class relationships that were established at the beginning of this whole situation, and they're not going to give up their position, obviously, and they righteously revolt against it, the lower class do, but it has the effect of derailing the whole society. And I think
Mm.
the thing is that many people actually don't want change. Like
Mm.
they at the end of the day, they're like, I do just want this system to like work a little better. I
Mm-hmm.
do just want to continue the benefits of the way of life that we have. But like,
Mm.
can we make things, if they're on the left side, they're like, I'm gonna buy fair trade coffee and like chocolate that's not made by slaves, right? Even though that's almost impossible. Like that, the slavery always finds its way into your products, right?
Well, what's fascinating to me is when you try to generate on AI. This tells you a lot about the ruling ideologies. I tried to use Google VO3 to generate like images of what a communist society would look like, a fully automated communist like just because I hate that term, by the way. I have a
Yeah.
whole it's something I've shifted actually in my thought a lot against. But the like it actually looks remarkably like capitalism, but with like more technology.
Right. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
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 For sure. Yeah, well, I mean, but that's the thing is like, on some level, people make fun of the Star Trek future, but it makes sense why people want it. You could say it's like a fantasy or whatever, but like, at least, again, like going back to this thing of like some kind of like vision of where we're going. The reason why I think why Marxism doesn't motivate people, not the way it used to, the vision's not plausible anymore. It's not even clear, right? Like you said, like there was that disillusionment with, okay, does this all just lead to the Soviet Union? Or we look at the situation today, kind of the point I was making, where it's like it doesn't seem like a lot of these class distinctions that were drawn in past times really apprehend any. And it also, with this like union of state interest and capital, however we want to think about it, oftentimes it's not really clear whether what you're criticizing is state power or the power of corporatism. And I guess that would be maybe my final point to make is like why I kind of resist just saying like it's just corporate influence on the state is that I think that discounts like the real ideological commitments that people have that flow out of their position in society, but not necessarily because they're like a capitalist,
Mm.
right? It's that same attitude of like I don't really want things to change, right? Maybe I'm not owning the means of production, but I've got like, a house, two cars, two kids, a dog and a cat and a nice neighborhood. And maybe you work for an intelligence service, right? And maybe that makes you feel like, okay, it's justified for me to provide intelligence that lets us, bomb the Houthis or whatever, so we can
Hmm.
keep trade flowing to Europe because 5% of that trade going through the Suez like comes to us. And I don't want any reduction in our way of life, right?
Hmm.
There are people who think like that and that they don't actually need to be bought off by corporate power. But that
Mm.
is like, you could say like capital's gotten into their brain or whatever, or something like that. To me, that's almost just not like an interesting thing,
No,
like
well,
to bring up. But
I think it's
sorry.
also like a lot of people have these views because there's just objectively no other alternative on the horizon. So why
Sure.
would they think of anything else?
Right. Well, you brought up Mark Fisher a couple times, and that's his thesis in many ways that
Yeah.
people can't see the end of capitalism.
But it's
But
not even just that people can't see it. It's that like there just isn't one. So because of that, it's not like it's not an ideological thing. It's like people aren't, thinking about they're not like the reason why there's no socialist revolution right now is not because people are brainwashed into thinking there's no alternative. It's because there just isn't one being put forth at any kind of mass level.
yeah,
That like it's a real thing. So it's like in many ways it's not like irrational to be skeptical, right? Of like especially when you have like so much of the left comes so much of so-called socialists will come from like, backgrounds more privileged than the people they're talking to, telling
yeah.
them about this communism thing. They're gonna be skeptical. I mean, you're pointing at something like do you have anything else to add before I respond?
No, no.
Okay, so there's I think two things can be true at once. On the one hand, I think people actually do want change, but that doesn't mean necessarily socialism or communism or whatever. But I think people do want change, and in fact, I think the Trumpist right has done it really is actually appealing to the people who want change the most. And if you look at like the Canadian election, it was really the Liberal Party who was the conservative candidate. Like it was a conservative force against Polyev, who was representing populist right wing politics that ultimately was promising a nothing burger, but was at least like talking about change. But like it was a change a lot of people didn't want in Canada because people saw that what Trump was doing was just they didn't like what Trump was doing. They were really scared about like the Trump's policy on Canada. That it was actually almost like a conservative response to vote for the Liberals to prevent Polyev, because even though Polyev, the leader of the Conservative Party in Canada, wasn't like necessarily going to bring that big of a change. He was promising something of a change. And because he's on the right, people are like, well, I don't want any risk of any whatever this Trump stuff is. Anything close to that, we don't want it. So voting liberal is kind of like a conservative thing. Now, I use that not as a pejorative because I think it is very stupid to think that like change in general is always better than no change, right? On the one hand, people do objectively want something to change, or else, why would they be voting for an orangutan in the White House? Like clearly it is something that there's some sort of yearning there. And why are they, going to this right wing populism
Well,
in Europe? They
well,
want some kind of
can
change, but that doesn't,
I
yeah, yeah.
interject something really quick though?
Yeah.
Because, like, I agree. Like, that's kind of what I was getting at earlier. There's like a
Yeah.
general malaise with modernity because there's no point to anything. I think is really the ultimate thing. There's not a sense of like national destiny or like old medieval Europe. Like we're spreading Christendom. There's just nothing. It's a you work and you get pleasure, and other people get pleasure, right? Like that's all we're doing.
Mhm.
But so I agree that malaise is there. But what I was kind of pointing to is like when I say people don't really want change, they just want the system to work better. I think that's why they're always reaching back to like things were so
Yeah.
good in the
No,
90s.
yeah, I'm in agreement on that.
Okay.
I'm just,
But I
but
think Trump
I'm
represents
only,
that in a way. Like Trump is a
no, I
conservatism
think,
that wants to go back to the 90s, I think.
yeah. Wait, did you say 90s?
Yeah. Yeah. I
Yeah,
think
well,
that
actually, I agree. Yeah, I agree with that. Actually, a lot of people think he's talking about the 50s, but I think he's talking about the 90s.
yeah, no, I think it
Yeah.
is. And the
Yeah.
way he wants to get there, I don't think is going to work for a variety of reasons.
Well,
And it can
obviously.
appear very radical to people, but I think in a way like that's what he's the era that he's nostalgic for, like on a
Hmm.
personal level.
For sure. Yeah, because he's a liberal. That's the thing about he's a conservative liberal.
Sure. Yeah,
Trump
that's true in a lot of ways.
Trump is not like really so I mean he's really not socially conservative in any sense. And that's on the one hand like a good thing and a bad thing in the sense that like there's some stuff about social conservatism that is just like objectively not bad. In fact, a lot of things that you would find in the Soviet Union or a lot of socialist countries that are conservative attitudes, but like for example like the idea of marriage and some degree of like more sexual morality. I mean that is to be applied to men just as much. And in fact, like Trump is like the least because like look, Obama was respected by his opponents, by Romney and McCain, because he was ultimately like a family guy who did not have a lot of scandals. Even I remember Romney was asked in the election, like, would you at politics aside, would you think Obama is a good person? And he said, yeah, I think Obama is a very honorable man. And yeah, I mean, you have that. Trump is just on another like Trump, the amount of divorces he's had. I mean, he's paid off prostitutes. Like, he's like the least, the level of like behavior conservative person ever. He's like you would call it the definition of like a sexual deviant or just like a deviant. Period. I mean, who knows? Who knows what his connection about Epstein is all about too? Like that, we're not even including that. That kind of got us off track there, but you mentioned about the change thing. What I think is crucial to emphasize is that while it's true people might want to change things a bit, I think there is this broader tendency in humanity as a whole, which is a conservative tendency, and that people more often than not will be skeptical of radical changes. And that is a hard truth, I think. And it's because people are hardwired to generally prefer what is working, even if it's working poorly, than something that might risk not working at all. It is usually when people have nothing to lose where they will risk stuff dramatically. Now, what does that mean? Does that mean radical change is impossible? No, I think it means that we should look more closely at how radical change actually happened. What a lot of people don't look like, especially people on the left, tend to overlook is that like a lot of the most radical change that has succeeded, quote unquote, comes from a somewhat conservative position. You look at, let's start with the American Revolution, which, in many ways is kind of the birth of most, if not all, revolutions in the modern era. The American Revolution was made in name of the British liberal values essentially being not respected. The British constitutional rights on, no taxation without representation and all that, as well as an attempt to want to go beyond what the British were doing. The British were seen to no longer be living up to their ideals because the British were, compared to the rest of the world, pretty radical at the level of like constitutional rights, at that time, compared to like medieval France.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
it's part of why Britain never really had a revolution of its own. It's because it was like ever since the Glorious Revolution, if you count that, but because it was able to adapt so well. You look at the French Revolution, like there's all this attempt before the French Revolution happened where they tried to like reform the system. They tried to like even appeal to like the ancient past. That's where they brought back the parliaments because they used to like have this ritual dating back since 1200, which is where you first see the term parlement appear. It's something we now associate with democracy, but it was actually just, essentially more or less an assembly where aristocrats and the clergy and the king would get together and try to figure shit out and talk about it. That's why parlement, speak with
Right.
each other.
And that was
And
ended in like the Fronde, right? like Louis the 14th or
Yeah, and then, well, and there was a constitutional crisis with right, like, leading up to the French Revolution, and that ultimately where you get like the left, right, and center kind of divide. You could say the birth of the right and left, because you had the people who ultimately were like, "Be gone with the king." Some people who wanted to, ultimately do a constitutional monarchy like England, and then some people want to preserve it completely. But at the end of the day, what it took to even get there was recalling like old rituals of parliaments. You can see this in like Tocqueville's writings on the French Revolution. He talks about this in beautiful detail. And Tocqueville is a great thinker in general to understand like what we call democracy, because for him, he's actually very anti-democracy, but he praises America as providing a model that will actually make democracy safe for property owners and for elites ultimately, because he wants something between what the radicals in the French Revolution want and what and I'm saying this without any pejoratives, by the way. Some people think like they read into their own biases, words we might use. Like if I say radical or conservative, I don't use that as even a pejorative here. It's just like a descriptor. But
yeah.
so like you see a French Revolution leading up to it, there's a calling to like older traditions. In the Cuban Revolution, I'm really fast forwarding here, like I'm skipping a lot of history, but it's in the Cuban Revolution, Castro appeals to the Declaration of Independence. So does the Vietnamese. So do the Vietnamese. They're appealing to like old things. They also appeal to like Jose Martis, like an old Cuban revolutionary way back in the day. They appeal to these old traditions. You really see a pattern throughout history. Like radical movements appeal to the past, even when advancing something radically new. But even let's look at the Russian Revolution before the Bolshevik takeover. They're saying like what? That the czar betrayed the people by making the risk of getting the Russians in the war. It's ultimately like it's not just like overthrowing out of nowhere. It requires people feeling betrayed by the existing order, not so much like, oh, let's just experiment with a new thing. And to legitimize new change, you need to also steep it into the past to make it more familiar, whether that is solely rhetorics or, real. I think it's actually always both, because, ideas take a long time to germinate and to develop and mature. And it really does give an extra layer of legitimacy if you steep those new ideas into something that is in the past, which is why I think people who want to advance some kind of socialism that's totally alien to the American context or the context of the country they're advancing it in are never going to succeed. Like, for example, a socialism in America that thinks the American Revolution was nothing but a bunch of slave owners trying to protect their slaves, that's a vision's never going to succeed. Or an anti-liberal socialism, that's never going to succeed in America. Fascism won't succeed in America. It's too foreign. It was too foreign for Britain. Oswald Mosley, despite being almost the leader of the Conservative Party at one point, a serious contender before joining the British Union of Fascists, was ultimately, didn't come close because his vision of like fascism was way too foreign to the liberal culture of England. You have to position a new politics that actually seems familiar and maybe even is actually more true to the tradition than the existing order. This new radical vision can help fulfill the tradition or make it real or be more true to this existing familiar political tradition that people across the aisle will appeal to. Mao, okay?
Yeah.
Mao in China, well, just the Chinese Communist Party, they always would totally uphold Sun Yat-sen, legendary Republican revolutionary of China, right? People on the right revere him too. People in Taiwan revere him, but so do the communists because he's a staple of Chinese tradition. So, like in Canada, a lot of people will like to look at Tommy Douglas, although I don't want to actually use this because I'm not sure about the audience and if they'll even know who that is. Let's use a more familiar example. Martin Luther King. Martin Luther King appealed heavily to Christian tradition and liberal tradition to legitimize ultimately like a politics of emancipation, not even just for Black people, it's obviously especially for Black people, but for humankind as a whole.
Yeah, he advocates for a UBI in his like final book.
And was a Marxist in a we could say not certainly not an orthodox one, but I was certainly more of a Marxist than Malcolm X was in terms of being using even the language in his work.
Yeah, I think Malcolm X was more Nietzschean.
Perhaps, yeah, perhaps. I mean,
Well, there's a huge thread of Nietzscheanism in the Black Power movement in general.
and in Islam, if you want to go into that rabbit hole. But
Sure. So do you want to give like a final message or anything you want people to check out or shout out your
sure.
channels or anything?
If you're interested in the podcasts I do, which are kind of like similar subject material to this, I would definitely recommend One Dime Radio. I upload weekly on the podcast. You can find it on Spotify, Apple, and on YouTube as well. I also do on Patreon the Backroom episode. It's the kind of extra podcast I do for every episode. We have a separate section where we delve into even more stuff, sometimes stuff that is more even contentious, that, like, let's just say people in the back room are primed more than I would say the other people. Or sometimes it's just simply like we'll talk about stuff that the guest doesn't want to say publicly, but they're cool if it's with a smaller audience. And the main channel I haven't uploaded in 9 months at the time we're recording this, and I've been in the process of a big series of comeback videos. One is on, I can just say what it is. It's basically it's just on Marxism explained, but told as a story, as opposed to like, here's what Marxism is. It's more told like a story with its history. And the other banger video, which is 1 hour and a half long right now, which is explaining every single type of Marxism ever. It's an explained mass appeal video, but probably my biggest video ever. And I also have a book coming out on democracy, managed democracy, on Revo Press.
Awesome. Well, Tony, it's been a pleasure. We'll do it again.
Appreciate it. This was a fantastic conversation. Stay in touch.
If you enjoyed the Nietzsche podcast or found it helpful, you can visit us and support the show at patreon.com/untimely-reflections. The link is in the description. Or just share the show with any of your friends that you think might enjoy it, or on social media. Thank you for your support.